It's Wednesday, September 9th, 2015, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, the Ferguson Effect, a story in the New York Times attributes a rise in homicides in big cities to what happened in Ferguson last summer. Is that really a thing? Because critics say no and call Monday's piece misleading and fear-mongering. The dentist who took Cecil the lion on safari this summer spoke exclusively to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and Associated Press before returning to work yesterday and provided a stark reminder of what it can be like when you're at the center of a media circus. And Aretha Franklin convinced a judge to issue an injunction and stop the screening of the film Amazing Grace at the Telluride Film Festival this weekend. We'll tell you why. And there's a lot more that hopefully we're going to get to as well before our half hour is up. I want to start, though, with the refugee crisis unfolding in Europe and how the coverage of the civil war in Syria changed almost in an instant last week with this photo of a little Aylan Kurdi's body washed up on a Turkish beach. In some frames, the 3-year-old looked like he was asleep, and others he's being carried away from the waterline by a paramilitary police officer. The images are gruesome, but they're images of war, and it's a war that's killed nearly 250,000 people in Syria and displaced as many as 8 million others. Since that series of photos went viral, some EU countries have opened up their borders to Syrian refugees. Some agreeing to up their quotas for immigration, if not lift them entirely. The Pope says that the Vatican is going to house 2 families and urged each parish to try and do the same. The Obama administration is looking at what it's going to do as well. In a lot of ways, it was the power of social media in that 1 or 2 or 3 images that changed how the world is viewing what's going on in Syria.
I think that's possibly true, that it's changed the way the world is viewing it. And there are people in a lot of circles, including one of ours, Rick Shaw, who's the director of Pictures of the Year International, who thinks that this is going to make a difference, that it's going to change public opinion. It really is a terrible image and an impactful image. But I'm afraid I don't believe, given past events, that it's going to stick with us for very long. And I don't think that it necessarily by itself has caused changes in how European governments have reacted or how our government is belatedly reacting. I'm just not sure I'd go that far.
I would agree with Mike. I don't see long term how the images are going to have much of an impact, especially in the way in which social media works now. I mean, it changes from day to day. I mean, you have this image here, and it may last for a week or two, and then another image will come up on something totally different, and people will flock in that direction. So it's going to be interesting to see how long this lasts. But I think the crisis itself is starting to get a lot of play from the news media. I mean, especially here in the United States. I mean, we aren't very good at covering international events, but this one we've started to gravitate on, mainly because of just the sheer volume of people who are migrating from Syria up through Greece and then trying to reach Germany and other places. And it's also pointing out the stark reality that there are some countries in Europe who are basically saying, no, we will not take these immigrants. And that causes some conflict, which also generates a lot of media buzz.
I have to say, though, I do think that generally speaking, the media in this country and in Europe have covered that story pretty well, the controversy about whether or not certain countries would allow immigrants in or put up roadblocks, the different decisions by various governments to decide that finally they are in Germany and Great Britain and elsewhere. The image, though, to me is not so much what lasting impact it's going to have on policy. I do believe that people are going to remember that picture. I mean, we've seen some of the coverage comparing it to little Bailey, who was carried out by the firefighter from the Oklahoma City bombings, right. And everybody remembers that picture, or remembers the picture of the little girl napalmed in Vietnam.
In 1972.
We remember those pictures.
Which did change a lot of public opinion about that war. That was one image of a child that, if nothing else, raised awareness to what was going on. Liz Sly, an international reporter with the Washington Post, somebody who I once called a colleague at the Chicago Tribune, she chose to tweet that image, and her tweet is available on our links blog. It is quite graphic, but she said at this point, those images need to be out there, and she's not apologizing for doing it. She caught a whole lot of flack. There were other journalists who retweeted her who also caught a lot of flack for doing that, being accused of maybe not issuing trigger warnings or making it really clear that something horrific was coming down the pike.
Well, I think in instances like this, you shouldn't warn people. They need to be emotionally jarred by what they're seeing. And I have to agree with Mike, is that these images will be iconic, I think, and be remembered for what they represented. One of the things that I'm not seeing in a lot of this is what's happening on the ground in Syria. Are the powers, the big powers, the United States, Great Britain, and others, who were initially engaged in trying to do something about the Syrian conflict, not hearing anything about, are they still engaged? What's going on? What's happening? What is being done to maybe stop the flow of migration out, or to end the civil war that's going on there? So much of the coverage is being focused on the migration that you're not hearing much about the Civil War.
I mean, I think another aspect of this that interests me from the media perspective is that we have shown images from Syria of lots of people gassed by the Syrian government. Mm-hmm. Did that cause any change in policy? Well, you could argue that it has not. When you show an individual human being, a defenseless little child, dying as a result of fleeing from the horrors there, it might have more impact. But there's also this sort of double standard that often takes place. American media, at least, will show the body of a person, even a child, from another place. They're not so inclined to show those same images of people when they're here in our own country, our own state, our own community. I mean, that image of Bailey from Oklahoma City is the only one I can think of off the top of my head, a really iconic image where we really didn't have that double standard.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you saw that image, but you didn't see a lot of those images during 9/11. Right. You saw some graphic images, and there are some iconic ones out there, but not involving children. And I think we sort of look at that as the other phenomena that we have in the U.S. media is that's happening over there, and it's not necessarily happening here.
And we've talked about that issue. I remember we talked about it specifically during one of the earthquakes, when we talked about Sanjay Gupta being televised doing brain surgery on a child, and the idea that that would never happen if it was here in the United States. But since he was overseas and performing that surgery, that perhaps our guide, that proximity can change our guide a bit.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's one of those things where we can sort of compartmentalize what we're seeing. And it's not very close to us, but if it's happening within our contiguous borders, then it's one of those, I'm talking about we in the media, mm-hmm. We have to think about whether or not we actually want to show that image for fear of having some sort of retribution against us by our viewers.
And I'm not sure there is a one-size-fits-all sort of ethical solution to this problem, but I do think that Ernest is right. In this particular case, we needed to see that image. And maybe we needed to see that image without a lot of warning ahead of time, because this is the impact of not only what's going on there, but the policies we are taking or not taking against the combatants.
Okay, well, take a look at Monday's New York Times, and there could be some cause for concern. Right there on the front page, above the fold, is a story with the headline, "Murder Rates Rising Sharply in Most U.S. Cities." The story looks at more than 30 big cities and rising homicide rates in those cities. What's behind it? Well, the story goes on to cite the Ferguson Effect, a notion that an out-of-control criminal element is keeping police from being able to get a handle on violent crime. The critics are all over this one, calling it irresponsible, fear-mongering, and saying that these crime statistics are being taken completely out of context.
I would have to agree with the critics. I read through all the stories that are on our Links blog. I went back and looked at some other stories. This is one of those things where you're starting to get criminologists, mm-hmm. You're starting to get sociologists and others who are beginning to do studies on what's happened in light of Ferguson. And then when you throw in on top of that the fact that you are having this increase in violent crime in the cities, then you have people who want to link that when it doesn't work. I mean, if you go through and you read the story, it says, well, in one instance, the murder rate in St. Louis was going up before Ferguson, but then in the next paragraph it says that, but police presence in certain areas of St. Louis has sort of diminished. So it's almost like you're not linking it, but the proximity of the wording of the story sort of causes some of that.
So I'm going to respectfully disagree on this one, at least in part. And I'll tell you why. Because first of all, the New York Times story, the headline doesn't mention Ferguson Effect. The lead paragraph doesn't mention Ferguson Effect. It's a 37-paragraph story, and there are 3 paragraphs in there where they talk about the Ferguson Effect. One of them is entirely given away to a critic who says it doesn't exist. Now, so I think that the critics are maybe being there for their own, maybe well-placed motivations, are trying to critique a story that isn't what they say it's about. On the other hand, I will agree that the Times didn't prove the story statistically. On the other hand, the critics haven't proven that it's not correct either. The problem is not enough time has passed. There's only been 1 year that they're comparing from last year to this. There could be a spike. It could be part of sort of seasonal fluctuations. We don't know yet. Nobody knows yet.
That I would agree with you on that point. After going through all of this, we don't know yet. And one of the other things that I think is very important that viewers and readers need to understand is that when you start talking about those statistics, you start talking about what's reported, what actually happened, whether or not it's being investigated, whether or not there was an arrest. The story also talked about the fact that a lot of this is the crimes that are committed. People know each other. Mm-hmm. And so it's not this sort of gang activity. It's actually people who know each other are arguing, and all of a sudden somebody decides to take out a gun and start firing. I mean, it happened in Colombia this past weekend where at a party somebody gets into a fight and he gets upset and then he goes and gets a gun and he comes back and he shoots up the VFW hall. I mean, this is indicative of what's going on around the country, but you can't connect it to Ferguson.
My problem is that I think that this isn't the greatest expose that the Times has ever done. I think probably the story isn't that important in illuminating what the causes are because nobody knows the causes. And they say in the story, here are all these different potential explanations. But what I have a problem with is that there are people saying basically, well, this story gives ammunition to the folks who are going to blame the Black Lives Matters, crowd, or is going to support the cops who say that people are targeting them.
They're going to do that anyway.
They're going to do it. It doesn't matter how the Times covers this story. You just have to look at the story in and of itself. Was it a worthwhile piece? Was it written fairly? And I really don't buy this argument that there was some sort of false equivalence there, because I think nobody knows, and they gave opportunity in that story to anybody and everybody who had an alternative explanation.
I would agree with you on that, but I would say one thing. I think journalists in this heightened emotional era that we're in right now, involving violence and race and the linkage of those two, we need to be careful in the words that we use and how we use them and who we talk to.
Can I follow up on that point? Because one of the things I wanted to bring up was I have a real problem with the headline on the story and the use of the word murder, because a murder and a homicide are not necessarily the same thing. Murder, it is an actual legal charge, and it indicates that there was intent. You can have a homicide, you can be looking at homicide rates, that doesn't necessarily mean it was murder.
No,
manslaughter is still homicide.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And so when you're talking about words mattering,
But also, I mean, how you can't deny the fact that the public is concerned about the problem of rising crime in urban areas. Whether or not it's a lasting trend or a blip on the screen, real people's lives are being impacted, and a lot of people have something to say about it, and the media need to cover those kinds of stories. Right. This can't be the only story about that subject, but it certainly fits in with the overall coverage that we do need to do.
Yeah.
Okay, well, can we talk about Kim Davis for a second, the Kentucky County Clerk who spent the weekend in jail rather than sign marriage certificates to same-sex couples because she says it's against her religious beliefs to do so. She got out of jail yesterday afternoon, but not before days of making front-page headlines across the country and having rallies held on her behalf outside of the courthouse, like this one, immediately following her release.
We serve a living God who knows exactly where each and every one of us is at. Just keep on pressing. Don't let down, because he is here. And he's worthy, he's worthy. I love you guys. Thank you so much.
At that rally, presidential candidate Mike Huckabee said he'd rather spend the next 8 years in jail to support her religious freedom. Even Josh Hawley, an MU law professor running for attorney general in this state, voiced his support for her. I mean, this is the type of thing that media circuses are made of. You have a low-level government office holder in a relatively small town, small jurisdiction, taking a stand, going rogue, if you will, by deciding not to follow the Supreme Court's decision, and it blows up on every level.
Well, I'm not surprised by this. I mean, when you have a landmark decision like this, there's going to be resistance, especially if the resistance has been there all along. You can go back to Brown versus Board of Education. I'm going to be talking about this in class on Friday. When that decision came down to desegregate the schools, there was massive resistance that even goes almost up until today. So you're going to continue to see this. I mean, she's indicative, and she fits that media circus example profile that you just gave, and it fits into that. But I would say that you're probably going to have various forms of resistance around the country, both from a legal standpoint as well as from an open overt standpoint, as Kim Davis has displayed. So I'm not surprised by this at all.
I mean, it does have all the components of a media circus, but again, I'm going to say the fault for that isn't so much with the media as it relies on those people who are showing up because the media happen to be present. I mean, this is a real news story. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of public importance. She is the first elected public official that we know of who is saying, I'm not going to follow the law. There's a judge in another state, I forget where it is, who apparently is not doing it.
I think it's down in Alabama, yeah.
But I mean, the point of it is, this for any definition you give to news, this is a news story, and it's an important news story, and people want to know more about it. And I think the media have, because their cameras are there, are causing the kind of protests we might not see otherwise. Certainly Mike Huckabee wouldn't be there if it weren't for the camera.
Or Ted Cruz,
yeah.
Or Ted Cruz. But it is a story, and I think the reporters I've watched who've been covering this story have tried to do a fair job of communicating what the distinctions are and why a public official is expected to uphold the law. Plus, they're also giving plenty of time to people who believe there are religious liberty issues involved.
And I think that's where the next part of the story is going to go, because that religious liberty aspect is what's going to be used in people trying to resist this from a legal standpoint or from a legislative standpoint. You're going to see, as legislatures reconvene in January across the country at the state level, various bills that are going to be pushed for this religious liberty sort of legislation to bring it back before the courts in an effort to resist the Supreme Court's decision.
You had a link on our links blog that I thought was really interesting, Amy, because it was from Greg Sargent with the Washington Post, and he's talking about the fact that there's a part of the story that isn't being covered really well, and that's the fact that overwhelmingly in all the states in the country, including those states that had bans on gay marriage before, as far as we can tell, elected officials are following the law. Now, because that's not news in some people's definition because it's not novel or different, but it's a part of the story we need to tell more. And in fact, in the Columbia Daily Tribune story that you referencing that Attorney General's candidate here in Missouri, they did point out the fact that in the state of Missouri, it does not appear that anyone is violating that law.
Sometimes that is news, though, when things are going as they are supposed to be going. Sometimes that is news.
That is news that should be covered.
Yeah.
I mean, but it doesn't fit that novelty
Sure.
that we talk about all the time.
Yeah. Well, with the unofficial end of summer, suburban Minneapolis dentist Walter Palmer returned to work at his dental practice. You may not remember his name, but when I tell you Palmer was the hunter who took Cecil the lion while on African safari, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. He says he wasn't in hiding, but that he wanted to keep a low profile to protect his wife and daughter, and because everyone knew who he was and how he spent his summer vacation. Before returning to work this week, Palmer gave interviews to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and the Associated Press, talking about the hunt, which he still defends, and his summer, and his need to get back to the office to serve his patients and staff of employees who depend on him.
Extra days! Extra days!
When the story broke in July, protesters swarmed Palmer's Bloomington, Minnesota dental practice, shutting it down. He now says he plans to reopen the clinic tomorrow, saying, I have a lot of staff members and I'm a little heartbroken at the disruption in their lives.
He's a very intense individual. He had this locked-in look the whole time. He was fidgety at times, but he didn't want to get into the core detail of how this lion was killed.
So it was actually our associate producer, Claire Banderas, who suggested we talk about this today and talk a little bit about what it's like when maybe you don't necessarily do something wrong. We can debate whether or not he did in this case, but the idea of a private citizen who, through no overt action of their own, becomes the center of a media circus like this.
Well, again, I'm not sure I will accept those conditions that you put on it, because okay. I don't think we know that he broke the law, certainly, and I doubt that he'll ever be extradited back to Zimbabwe to testify on whether or not he broke the law. There is some question as to whether or not what he did was moral or immoral, and there's a lot of people around the world who feel that he did what he did was wrong.
I don't know that that's the part so much that she was hoping that we would talk about, but that idea of having journalism done to you for doing something that you may not necessarily think that was immoral or was wrong, and how that can quickly impact all the people around you.
I hate to say it, but it happens all the time, and oftentimes individuals are going to be damaged by coverage of news stories, and we will justify them because there's a larger public good or issue to be discussed. And I certainly don't condone what people on social media have said about him or the threats that he and his family feel as a result of the way that this story has been followed. But it is, again, a story, and we have to try not to do harm to individuals, but we also have to weigh that against, is this a story that people need to hear about?
And I think once the story grew, he tried to figure out a way to control the story in a way that was going to benefit him. So in trying to sort of deal with it, he became part of the story as well. So, I think it's just one of those things where he may not have intended to do that when he went on safari. He may have thought that everything was set up for him to be able to go and do the thing that he likes to do, which is big game hunt. And it turned in another direction when either by his own choice or someone else's choice, he wound up shooting this lion, and then it snowballed from there once social media got a hold of it.
Well, the difference I would argue in this case from Kim Davis is she was a public official engaging in an act of civil disobedience. She put herself in the center of that, whereas Palmer didn't necessarily do that.
It depends on how much he knew about the controversy over big game hunting and what was legal or not legal. We don't know.
Okay. Well, this next story that we're going to talk about started 43 years ago. Sidney Pollack filmed Aretha Franklin's performance at the Los Angeles New Temple Missionary Baptist Church for his documentary, Amazing Grace. But the film wasn't ever released because of sound problems. Pollack wasn't happy with how the sound turned out. He died in 2008. Producer Alan Elliott ended up with the footage and has been trying to release the film since 2001. It was supposed to screen this past weekend at the Telluride Film Festival, but a judge put a stop to it at the request of Aretha Franklin.
I really want to see this, but I also am cognizant of the fact that Aretha Franklin is saying, wait a minute, there was an agreement on the table between me and this producer that this would not go public. And he is violating that by trying to show this at Telluride and to sell the rights to this to go globally, and that violates the agreement that we had, and that's why she went to the judge. So she has the right to do that.
Now, the Chicago Film Festival has voluntarily pulled the film. The Toronto Film Festival, as of the time we're having this conversation, is still planning on screening.
Actually, I just checked moments before we went on the show, and it's now been withdrawn from the Toronto International Film Festival. I would like to see it too. It sounds like a fascinating film, but apparently they did not get her approval to release it. And then the other argument is, well, of course, if you have some historic footage for something that involves education or commentary or news or whatever, there is a fair use exemption in the copyright law. We use it for this program 4 times today. But the judge argued in this case that basically the documentary was going to use almost the entirety of the concert as part of the documentary.
Which is actually the album.
That's not fair use, though, or at least arguably it's not fair use.
And I think that's basically what he's saying is that, look, if you play that entire thing, that's the entire album. And she's entitled to certain rights, and especially if there was an agreement in place before, you have to abide by that agreement. You can't just go out and do that without working out the details with her so that both parties can agree upon that.
So you say you want to see it?
I still want to see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, after much fanfare, the wait is finally over.
Hello, nation. Folks, I don't know what that means. Well, folks, if I knew you were going to do that, I would have come out here months ago. Thank you for all joining me for my first episode of The Late Show With, starring Stephen Colbert. I am he. You are all witnessing television history, and like most history, it's not on the History Channel. And I am so excited to be here right now. I am also so excited to be at home 6 hours from now watching this on TV. Hi, me. Hey. Hi, Stephen. Don't tell me how it went. I'm watching this later. No spoilers.
Stephen Colbert is back on the air, host of CBS's The Late Show. Gone is his ultra-conservative alter ego we came to know and love on Comedy Central. Did the first show live up to the hype?
You know, I watched it, and, you know, he didn't reinvent late-night comedy. He said he wasn't trying to do that. His comedy bits were strong. His point of view came through. The band seemed to be okay. The interviews, I don't know. His interview with Bush was actually, with Jeb Bush, was kind of interesting. The whole thing with George Clooney kind of left me cold because they were trying to do a real interview and they were trying to cram a comedy bit into it, and I just didn't get it. But, you know, pretty good start, I'd say.
No, I think it was a pretty good start. What I like about it was the fact that he, in the opening and all of those, I mean, he kept it sort of traditional, but the band, you could tell, was new, and they were going to try to do some things differently. The opening was new, looking at New York from a different perspective. The fact that he did his own opening, and then he sort of went away from that. You could see him put the mic down and that sort of thing. So I thought that was unique, but I think he's going to try to keep it as close to what's been on for a while, but as he goes along, I can see that he's going to want to bring in some new things. I agree with Mike. I thought the George Clooney interview just fell pretty flat. Yeah.
I'm just going to be curious to see whether or not he gets into using social media the way that, you know, that Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon and Conan O'Brien are doing. I didn't see a lot of that last night, but he did a lot of that leading up to the launch of the show. So we'll see.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. Find that under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show. Maya Jackson is our technical director. Pat Akers handled our audio, and Claire Banderas is our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.